მოგესალმებით, დიდი მადლობა მონაწილეობისთვის. დღეს პოლიტიკური წიგნიერების სემინარის მეორე დღეა და ვისაუბრებთ ისეთ მნიშვნელოვან თემებზე, რომლებიც ეხება წინასაარჩევნო კვლევების ინტერპრეტაციას და ინტერპრეტაციას ამ კვლევების მომხმარებლების მიერ. მათ შორის არიან პოლიტიკური პარტიები, რომლებიც იყენებენ, როგორც აღნიშნეთ, წინასაარჩევნო კვლევებს თავიანთი ამორჩევლების პოზიციებისა და დამოკიდებულებების შესასწავლად და საარჩევნო პერიოდში პოზიციონირებისათვის. ინტერპრეტაციის კომპონენტი ასევე თანაბრად მნიშვნელოვანია, ვიტყოდი, ექსპერტებისა და მკვლევრების შემთხვევაშიც, რადგან ისინი არიან ცალკეული ცალკეული პოლიტიკური პარტიებისგან და მათი მოთხოვნის შესაბამისად ახორციელებენ ამ კვლევებს. იგივე ინტერესი აქვს მედიას, განსაკუთრებით იმ შემთხვევაში, როდესაც მას პარტიული კავშირები გააჩნია და ეს არ არის მხოლოდ საქართველოსთვის დამახასიათებელია, არამედ მედიის მფლობელებს ხშირად აქვს გააჩნიათ მსგავსი პარტიული კავშირები და გარდა ამისა ყველა პროფესიონალს, მათ შორის მკვლევარს, ექსპერტს, ჟურნალისტს გააჩნია საკუთარი პოლიტიკური გემოვნები. მაგრამ ამ გემოვნების გადათარგმნა არ უნდა მოხდეს გარკვეულწილად და შესვლა ჩვენს პროფესიულ საქმიანობაში, ამიტომ მნიშვნელოვანია მიუკერძებლობის პრინციპების დაცვა, როგორც პოლიტიკოსების, ისე მკვლევრებისა და ჟურნალისტების მხრიდან. ეს სამი სეგმენტი არის ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი, კვლევების მომხმარებლები არიან. და ამ საკითხებზე დღეს პრეზენტაციას პროფესორი ტრაუგორტი გააკეთებს, რომელსაც აქვს თავად განხორციელებული ექსპერიმენტული კვლევა თავის კოლეგებთან ერთად და მთავარი კითხვა მისი კვლევის, რომელიც ეხლა გამოქვეყნდა კომუნიკაციების ჟურნალში, არის ის, რომ თუ რატომ ახდენენ საარჩევნო კვლევების განსხვავებულ ინტერპრეტაციას ექსპერტები, პოლიტიკოსები და მოქალაქეებიც, ხო? შემდეგ ჩვენ გადავალთ უფრო ტექნიკურ დეტალებზე, სადაც ქალბატონი რასა პროფესორი რასა გვესაუბრება კონკრეტულად როგორ ხდება შეწევრის პროცედურები და იმ საკითხებზე, თუ როგორ უნდა მოვახდინოთ შედეგების ინტერპრეტაცია თითქმის თანაბრად გაყოფილ ელექტორატში. თანაბრად გაყოფილ ელექტორატში ალბათ გულისხმობთ იმას, რომ ამის მაგალითი ალბათ იქნება ის, რომ საქართველოს საპრეზიდენტო არჩევნები მაგალითად 2018 წელს, როდესაც ჩვენ მეორე ტურიც დაგვჭირდა და ეს არის საკმაოდ მნიშვნელოვანი საკითხები იმისთვის, რომ არც ერთმა მომხმარებელმა, როგორც ჟურნალისტებმა, ისე პოლიტიკურმა პარტიებმა და თვით ექსპერტებმაც და მკვლევარებმა, რომლებიც ამ პროცესებში არიან ჩართული, მაქსიმალურად დაიცვანეს ეთიკური სტანდარტები, კვლევის სწორი მეთოდოლოგიები გამოიყენონ და ამ მედიის მეშვეობითაც ამ შედეგების სწორი ინტერპრეტაცია მოხდეს. ეს არის ის მნიშვნელოვანი თემები, რომელსაც დღეს ჩვენი სპიკერები და ტრენერები რომლებზედაც ისაუბრებენ. მე მინდა ახლა გადავცე სიტყვა ბატონ პროფესორ ტრაუგორტს. Please, Michael, floor is yours and we are looking forward to your exciting presentation. Thanks so much.
I was asked to speak to you today about difficulties interpreting poll results, and I've organized a presentation in order to do that. And I want to begin by talking about issues of language and vocabulary. And one of the central issues associated with organizing polls, collecting data, reporting on poll results is that there is a process of moving between the language of concepts, which are used by journalists, for example, or clients, and the language of measurement, translating these concepts into measurements, which survey methodologists call operationalization. It's a kind of a long word. It doesn't roll off your tongue, but it's an important notion of taking a concept and converting it into a measurement in a poll or a survey. But then when we write up the results or we talk to a journalist about publicizing the results, say in a media organization, the conversation turns back to the language of concepts. And things can be lost in translation moving between concepts, operationalization, and then back to concepts. And I'm going to be talking about that in a little more detail. I have constructed an example based upon a client, presumably it could be a legislator, a parliamentarian, or it could be a policymaker in a government agency who says, I want to know what the public thinks about building a new bridge over the Kura River. I started with another example when I began to organize my presentation, which had to do with climate change. Climate change turned out to be too complicated a concept to deal with because it was so difficult to measure attitudes about that. So I'm using this example. I want to emphasize that this is completely hypothetical. To the best of my knowledge, there are no plans to build a new bridge over the Kura River, but I want to use this as an example in my presentation. And in order to evaluate the quality of a survey or a poll that could measure these particular attitudes, it's very important that the methods be transparent. The methods of data collection and analysis be transparent. This is what Peter talked about in his presentation yesterday. But in the example I'm going to work with this morning, we want to know what is the definition of the public, that is the who, which questions were asked in the poll of the survey about the bridge, and then how was the analysis conducted. So I think it's important to just refer to the relevant actors in this process, because they are the ones who typically employ these different languages, have different vocabularies, and this explains often the difficulty of communicating among the groups. So media organizations and people who work there, journalists, they deal in the language of concepts, and they write about these concepts in a way, first of all, that should be intelligible to the general public. And they also apply other criteria like newsworthiness. So they're interested, for example, in current data, the newest poll results. They don't often contextualize them. The people who are engaged in data collection and analysis, the survey researchers or the pollsters, they deal in the language of and the vocabulary of measures, questions, response categories, other technical issues, as well as sampling, who is going to be asked the question. And obviously there is a matter of relevance, or the relationship between which questions are asked of which individuals. The public, by and large, doesn't know anything about polling methodology, survey research methods, but they consume this information in the language of concepts. And so they expect to get messages from, for example, the news media in conceptual terms. They think about it in conceptual terms. Politicians and policymakers are another important group involved in this process. And while they are interested in concepts, their specific interest is in taking this new information, often expressed in conceptual terms, but translating it into specific laws and policies. John DePiro, in his opening comments yesterday, talked about three relevant groups of participants in this process: public officials, elected officials, and policymakers, citizens, and journalists. And those are the appropriate actors to keep in mind when thinking about issues of interpretation of poll results. And it's important to remember that from the perspective of reporting on results, they're usually reported in conceptual terms, often without consideration of methodological details or consequences. This can be done both by the people who collect the data, although often they will have a methodological appendix, a methodology section attached to their report. Most people who read the report won't go to the methods section to pay attention to the details. And journalists are inadequately trained to deal with the methodological details of survey research. And of course, the public knows very little about the methods of polling or survey research as well. So one difficulty in designing polls and then analyzing and communicating the results is that most concepts are multidimensional. We think of, in our example, the concept of building a bridge, but actually there are a lot of elements associated with that and public evaluation of such a proposal. And typically, from an ideal measurement perspective, this would require more than one question to be operationalized appropriately. So, for example, the public might be interested in where the bridge would be located, or how much the project would cost. How much would it cost to build the bridge? And where would the money come from? Would it be publicly financed or would it be privately financed? Would there be environmental considerations involved? How serious would they be? What kind of considerations would they be? So you can see how there could be a series of questions that could address these and other dimensions of evaluation or assessment of the bridge project. But in a survey or a poll, the more questions you ask, the more expensive the survey becomes. And so the inadvertent oversimplification of concepts is, in a fundamental sense, a budget-related issue, ultimately, although often the people who are writing the questionnaire don't pay sufficient attention to the multidimensional nature or aspect of the project. So this oversimplification, in essence, makes it difficult in many circumstances for the respondent, the person who's being interviewed, to comprehend the question which they're being asked. So if we had more time and we were meeting in person, I might ask you to comment on this, although we could return to this later. But think about these questions and how a typical respondent could make sense of them. Do you favor or oppose building a new bridge over the Kura River? And I've just included in parentheses the possible response categories. Favor, oppose, or I don't know. Or a survey, a questionnaire in which we present the respondent with a list of public policy initiatives. And we ask them in this list, how much do you support or oppose the following initiatives, where the response categories are strongly support, strongly, somewhat oppose, strongly oppose. And in this list is an item, building a new bridge across the Kura River. as well as things like, just again, for example, increasing support for college and university tuition. Sometimes these lists can be very long. One problem that survey methodologists think about often is that for on many topics like this, the respondents don't have well-developed attitudes, and they don't think about these issues ordinarily until the point at which they're actually asked a question like this. And so there are questions about what the responses mean for something that for an issue or that the respondents haven't seriously or adequately considered. Another issue is who answered the question. What is, in effect, the definition of the public? You heard yesterday a fair amount of discussion about how to draw a representative sample of the public. And often the results of a poll are reported for the entire sample. But there are other important considerations for analysis that involve subsets of the sample, subgroups of the sample. For example, people who have different levels of knowledge about the particular topic. In this case, the bridge. And this could depend, of course, upon how much discussion there had been, for example, in a campaign or in the media, or whether there had, in fact, not been any discussion of the bridge at all. Another element is how interested people are in the construction of the bridge. And obviously within the public or within the population as a whole, there could be widely varying levels of interest. And it might be important to know how attitudes about the project, support or opposition to the bridge building project, varies by levels of interest. In many reports, the results are often presented only as what is called top-line data, that is the marginals for the entire sample. But there are many cases in which it would be important to know about the distribution of support for the project among relevant subsamples. So often we don't know directly, for example, how much knowledge people have about a project like the bridge, but we often make the assumption that levels of education can serve as a general indicator of knowledge about public affairs. Interest in projects like this could be another relevant explanatory variable for attitudes. So might be partisanship. Knowing where a respondent lives, even though we want to protect the confidentiality of an individual respondent, might be important because the bridge could be constructed potentially in a neighborhood near them, if they live by the river, or a neighborhood that could be affected by the traffic if the bridge were to be built. And another possible explanatory variable could be whether or not a person owned a car that they used to commute to work, and therefore they might find that the construction of the bridge would shorten their time to get to and from work. These are just meant to be examples of the way in which the total sample of the public, for the sake of our discussion, and as was used yesterday, the adult population could be subdivided into more useful groups to understand public values and interests about the project. So what happens when people are exposed to poll results? And how interested are they generally in poll results? And some research shows that there are actually two dimensions of public interest in poll results. One of them, which you might think of as kind of a horizontal dimension, is learning what their fellow citizens think about issues. And for some issues that are very salient in the public, of course, there might be a lot of information about what their fellow citizens think. Could be information that's reported in the media, but for other issues that haven't become salient yet, the publication of new poll results is important and useful information. This is a kind of a communication, and in some cases an entertainment function of the release of poll results. But there's also what you might think of as a vertical dimension to the public's interest in poll results, because in a democratic society and according to democratic theory, elected leaders are supposed to represent the views and the preferences of their constituents. And elections are a very important way in which during the campaign, for example, issues get discussed and members of the public, voters, can use this information to make their choices. But then between elections, there are fewer opportunities for the public to express their preferences, and polls represent an important mechanism by which, if the public is asked appropriate questions, the results of the poll can be used to communicate these preferences to elected leaders and to policymakers. And communicating the results of polls accurately and well is important because it's related to trust in the political system. That is, if the public sees the information being communicated, and they also have a sense that there's a response by the government, that tends to increase trust. If the data are collected and disseminated, but there's no reaction by either elected leaders or policymakers, that can result in lower levels of trust in the political system. And it's also important when we think about communicating and consuming poll results, that journalists who generally aren't trained in polling methodology, there isn't, as we say in the United States, a beat for journalists like City Hall or the Parliament that's associated with public opinion. They can't evaluate the quality of polls, and they tend to report any data that are new, generally irrespective of a quality assessment of the poll results. Now, elected officials obviously are interested in public opinion because of their relationship to voters, and they can look for guidance to design legislation and develop new policies based upon poll results. But they also have other sources of information. They have contacts from what we could describe as interested in and knowledgeable elites. These could be lobbyists. These could be strong partisans. These could be people who have a particular interest in the topic and organize letter writing campaigns or social media campaigns. This kind of communication from constituents and organized groups is very important, obviously, to elected leaders and to policymakers, although it may not necessarily be representative of the general public. This is the difference between a letter writing campaign and a poll result in which there's a good probability sample of adults in the population. I want to conclude my presentation by talking about a set of issues associated with how poll results are consumed by all of these groups, by journalists, by elected officials and policymakers, and the public, as a general problem of human nature. When psychologists talk about models of processing new information, how do people react to the presentation of new information? There are generally two commonly used models. One of them is technically called Bayesian updating. It's updating your current knowledge base. So you think you know something about a subject, you have a storehouse of knowledge, and then you get some new information about the same issue. And so you alter the content of your stored knowledge based on the new information. A second model, referred to as motivated reasoning, describes the way in which individuals discount conflicting information with regard to what they already know or believe. That is, individuals counter-argue against new information based upon their stored information database, internal database. Because of cognitive dissonance, they don't want to deal with new information and they don't want to change their attitudes or behavior. And one thing that is interesting about motivated reasoning and the research in which it's been tested as a model is that the most sophisticated individuals, those who have the highest levels of knowledge about a particular subject, or for example, in the political realm, those who are the strongest partisans, are the most likely to discount new information, to be able to counter-argue about the new information. They have stronger feelings, they have more information with which to convince themselves about the fault of the poll results, and so they do. And I want to say something about, without getting too technical, about the survey-based experiments that have been conducted to highlight and evaluate this motivated reasoning hypothesis and the corollary about the most sophisticated people. I'm going to report mostly on research that I've been involved with, although this has been replicated in many other studies. And this work I'm going to describe is done mostly with web-based surveys. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is that we use visual stimuli in these studies. And we present the respondents in typically two randomly assigned subsamples, one of two pieces of information that shows a current poll result. So in the upper left of this slide, you'll see what we call a vignette. It's a very small story to replicate a news article, but it has a graph in it that shows a poll that shows Hillary Clinton ahead of Donald Trump 44% to 42%. The other half of the sample would see the same stimulus the headline would say poll shows Trump is ahead of Clinton by 2 points. The red and the blue lines would be reversed. Okay. So in the United States, this is an example of one of the stimuli that we used, a poll showing a tight race, Clinton ahead by a little bit or Trump ahead by a little bit. We've done this work replicated this work in Mexico, which is a multi-party system in which we had 3 different parties leading and 3 different stimuli. Motivated reasoning has been shown to work with regard to policy issues as well as campaign-related polls. So on the right-hand side, you can see 2 visual stimuli which we used in a study in England, which shows public assessments of how well the government is handling the National Health Service. So in the upper graphic, 53% in this hypothetical poll said they're handling it well, 47% said badly. In the other version of the stimulus, you can see 47% said the government's handling it well and 53% badly. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of how the studies are conducted, the use of these visual stimuli, the same result, but switching sides in the presentation. Here are some results from the United States. And the basic assessment that we ask of each respondent for the stimulus that we present to them is, how informative do you think this survey is? How accurate do you think this survey is? How reliable do you think this survey is? Sometimes we analyze these items individually. Sometimes they actually form the 3 of them a good scale. And in the graphic on the right, which presents data on perceived accuracy, on the left, you will see that Republicans are much more likely to think that the poll showing Trump is ahead is accurate than they are to think that the poll showing Clinton ahead is accurate. And on the right, you can see that Democrats, this is self-identified party preference by the respondents, that Democrats are more likely to think that the poll showing Clinton ahead is accurate compared to the poll showing Trump ahead. So there's a perceptual screening that takes place here based upon the beliefs or the attitudes that the respondent carries with them or holds before they're asked the survey question or presented with the stimulus. So let me say in summary that in order to understand and interpret polls, the devil is in the details. That is, you have to know how the poll was conducted. You want to know about the wording of the questions, how the concept was translated into survey content. That also includes information, for example, about the order of the questions, the response categories that were provided, and so on. But only well-trained consumers can evaluate the methodological details as relatively good or relatively poor, right? That means that pollsters can evaluate each other's work reasonably well. Other kinds of survey researchers or academics who study public opinion can do this, but that the evaluation of the details can be more complicated for elected officials, for policymakers, and certainly for the average citizen. Even when there are well-conducted surveys, there will still be filters on how well the information is received, the evaluations of the results as accurate or credible based upon the pre-existing attitudes and beliefs that a person holds. This is an issue in the data that I showed you for samples of the mass public, but I'm sure that you're also familiar with conditions in which elected officials have discounted poll results because they suggest, the results suggest that, for example, the public holds a different view than the elected official does. This has consequences for public perceptions of pollsters and the results that they present. It has to do with evaluations of the role of pollsters in the civil society. But it also has this consequences I indicated for levels of trust in the government as well, in terms of how they're reacting to public preferences as expressed in the polls. And as a final point, I just want to emphasize that understanding these relationships between evaluations of poll results among these different groups should temper expectations for how we talk to journalists and to the public about the importance of polling and about the accuracy of the results that are portrayed. So that was my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mike. That was really, really insightful and interesting presentation. მეგობრებო, ხომ არა გვაქვს კითხვები? გთხოვთ, შეგვიძლიათ ან ჩატში მოვიწეროთ, ან უშუალოდ თქვენ დასვათ. If there is no questions, then I have two questions. First is more general. What would be your advice to the political staffers and political party members when they are commenting about poll results? In order to sound professional and towards public, and also don't miscommunicate some results towards public. This is one question. And the second one will be, you mentioned the research that even well-trained and knowledgeable experts are more susceptible to bias. This is the finding of the research. But do you know, or have you have any explanation why does this happen? Is it kind of a little bit surprising finding? Because generally those who are knowledgeable, they always ask more greater details about methodology, about concept, about operationalization, and because of also stakes related to their reputation.
The first one was about how to discuss or react to poll results that an elected official or policymaker in particular, I guess was your reference, might encounter. And I guess there's a distinction that has to be made between disagreeing with the result or thinking about an alternative way in which the concepts might have been measured, as opposed to sort of generically trashing polls and poll results. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, in this poll, the concept of constructing the bridge was dealt with too generically. And the respondents weren't asked about how to pay for it, or about how much environmental damage might be involved in the construction. And if those questions had been asked, I think that the opinions would have been different. Or I have another survey that shows that attitudes are different according to those considerations. So there's a difference between saying you should never trust polls and raising questions about the details of how a particular poll was conducted and whether there might be alternative ways to look at this particular set of issues. The second question was about why people who are most invested with a set of ideas about a particular topic are the most likely to counter-argue. And the answer to that, I guess, just lies in the psychological theory or explanation of cognitive dissonance, that people don't want to confront contrary information in relation to views or attitudes that they currently hold. And so the reaction is to think about a way to counter-argue or to discredit that new piece of information. I suppose a psychologist would call it a heuristic. It's a way of dealing with, these conflicting sets of information. And it's just a innate human process. And so one of the reasons I think we need to take this into account is that we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations. For example, about organizing education campaigns. If we teach people more about how polls are conducted, then they'll be more accepting of polls. It's not a matter of necessarily the details of the conduct of the data collection and the analysis of the data. It's more about how the results might or might not conflict with things that they already believe. I might add one other comment, by the way.
Sure.
It's about the way polls are reported because of by journalists and news organizations. Because of the emphasis on newsworthiness in media organizations, journalists are particularly susceptible to a press release or a press conference or the release of a report about new survey results. And actually, often the stories that they write or produce for television, because they don't have a lot of detailed information about how polls are conducted, involve simply extracting sentences from the report or from the press release. One thing that's often missing from this kind of reporting, which, as I said, is typical, is there's no contextualizing of the results based upon other surveys conducted on the same topic. So we don't often see, for example, stories that say, news stories that say, this is the same result that was collected in another survey that was conducted a month ago or 6 months ago, right? One reason is that because news organizations are often sponsors of polls, media organizations are sponsors of polls, they don't want to cite data collected by another news organization. So you have these kind of workways of the press that have an impact or a consequence for the ways in which polling data are reported, and therefore what the general public as consumers of this information receive.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike, a lot. Peter, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think Mike's examples are good examples from those survey experiments. They don't, because they present single polls, the reactions of the people in the polls are shaped by the brief information that is presented in the example. So, for example, in the case of the Trump versus Clinton poll, one might replicate that experiment and manipulate, in addition to the presentation of the results, the sponsorship of the polls. My guess is that if the poll that showed Clinton in the lead was said to have been sponsored by a media organization that typically supports Trump, it would have complicated the inference for the respondents who are judging whether the poll is accurate or not. Similarly, in the case of the NHS poll, or the one that concerned the National Health Service. So it goes back to a point we discussed yesterday. When we, as poll consumers, are looking at the results of any poll, as Mike has just pointed out, the context matters. And the various other polls that may exist and their varying methodologies and sponsorships and so forth give us a different picture than we get from any given poll about which we know relatively little. So it's important, I think, for us as consumers to look at the range of polls on a topic, their sponsorship, their question wording, their samples, etc., so as to come up with a picture that even for people with motivated reasoning may be harder to dismiss than the results of a given poll. It's harder for me to say that polls that poll results that suggest my candidate is not in the lead. It's harder for me to dismiss that if it is replicated multiple times using different methods with different sponsorship and so forth. So this is as Mike points out, a lesson for journalists, which is that they would like, or they typically report the results of a particular poll when it's released, but they do not provide the context within which that poll was done and the other polls that have been done on this topic.
Thanks, Peter, for your comment. ხომ არა გვაქვს კითხვები პიტერთან და მაიკთან? თუ კითხვები არ არის, მაშინ მე გადავალ ქალბატონ რასასთან, პროფესორ რასა ალისაუსკიანესთან, რომელიც ისაუბრებს შეწონვის პროცედურების საფუძვლებზე და საარჩევნო გამოკითხვების ინტერპრეტაცია თანაბარ გაყოფილ ელექტორატში. Please, Rasa.
So today I was asked to speak about two topics, about waiting procedures, what it is, and do we need it, and when we need it, and another one about also interpretation of election polls, including divided electorate. So first is more technical and will be probably a little bit shorter. And it's like continuation on what I was talking yesterday about the sampling. When we talk about sample, we need to know if we have, when we made the poll, when we are like politicians, like consumers, when we get the data results of the poll, how accurate the sample was, and is it really showing results of the target group of people we are interested in. In this case, we need some criteria to define a good quality sample. Again, as I talked yesterday, the sample should correspond to the universe. It means, let's say, voters of Georgia or voters of Tbilisi or whatever we are interested in, by most important and measurable values. Usually there are age of the respondents, gender, region where they live, type of settlement, village, town, city, education, occupation. These are the main social demographic variables which we can use for comparison of the sample with the total universe, with the population, with the target group we are speaking about. But this is not an exhaustive list. It might include other than social demographic variables like lifestyle, consumption patterns, media usage, various. The problem is that we need to be sure that the definition of the frame of all population is complete and up to date. So do we have good enough source like national statistic, electoral list, which we use for comparison, which we use for creating the sample? Another question we should ask, like consumers of the poll, like politicians, what kind of sampling procedures were used? As we talked today, it can be probability sample, when every voter or every individual have the same probability to be included in the sample, or we used quota sample, where we predefined how many men, women, people of certain age will be interviewed. It's very important. So we need to know, is really our sample is like a drop of blood in the blood test, or it's something else? It's how it differs from the body. Also, there can be systematic errors in the sample and non-systematic. To avoid systematic errors, we need to know, are there any barriers in reaching some groups of the population? Let's say geography, like people living in the mountains or far away. Can be some politics. Let's see, now we have some strikes, we have some political, let's see, protests in Georgia due to hydroelectric station. And can we do polling in this region or not? Are there any language issues? Let's see, are we using minorities languages in the polling, or are we asking only in Georgian? And various of these things. It might be that we are excluding from the poll some groups of people because of their definitions, not accidentally. Also, the question is, are some groups of population less responsive than others? And they may be underrepresented in the poll. Sometimes it's political reasons. As Natalia mentioned yesterday, that might be some people who, let's say, support extreme parties or very small parties are afraid to tell about this, and they keep quiet, they're not responding. All these factors are very important. When we use telephone interviews, also we have individuals with several SIM cards, several numbers. There are individuals who have, let's say, Georgian number, but they are out of the country. Again, all these factors are very important in order to examine how good sample is. So when we really are getting the results of the poll, we also should take into the consideration non-response and refusals. So what really share of people who were contacted during the polling refused to participate or just didn't answer some questions? And if possible, to know as much as possible information about the reasons why people are refusing to participate. In majority of cases, their reasoning is, I have no time, well, I'm not well educated, my, let's say, neighbor has more to face than me, but that's, in many cases, it's just excuses. It's very important to collect as much information as possible about really the structure of people who refuse to participate. Maybe it does not correspond with the national profile. Maybe it's older people, maybe less educated, maybe more rural. And it's especially important in the exit polls and in telephone polls, because then when interpreting the results, we should take care about these non-responses and refuses to know what their share is and how they differ from the rest of people who participated in the poll. Another important factors are seasonal migration, emigration, and let's say individual is included into voters register, but he resides in another place. Especially we have a lot of such people in bigger towns, like in Tbilisi, people who come from other regions of Georgia, but in municipal elections, let's say they are voting in their place of residence where they are registered. So again, if we include them in the poll in Tbilisi and ask whom they are voting for, it will be not true, because they would not vote in Tbilisi in that case, like an example. Also, we need to take into consideration some extreme situations like forest fires, evacuations, like pandemic last year. So all these important in order to examine how good sample is. So we are getting the survey data and we are getting the structure, social demographic structure of these people who participated. We compare these numbers with the statistics, and we can really improve, adjust the sample, the composition of people who were interviewed to match really statistical data. So this is called weighting of sample. And the purpose of weighting is to make statistical adjustments to this survey data in order to have more accurate picture of universe. In order to weigh data, we need independent variables which are characterizing the universe. The proportion of men, women in the society, let's say older than 18 years of age, education, locations of people, rural, proportion of rural, urban residents, so everything which describes population. And then we calculate coefficients, like we calculate the weight and assign these correction weights to all elements in the same stratum in our sample. Let's say, to make it more easy to understand, we know that from statistics, from census, that among the Georgians age 18 and over, population of women share is 56%. But we did the poll, and in our poll, for some reason, we have the share of 59% of women, which is more than it should be, and accordingly, the share of men will be lower than statistics shows. So in order to adjust our final estimates, we need to weight our sample by applying coefficient, which allows the share of women to be equal 56. So we minimize a little bit share of women in our sample. And usually variables used for weighting are age, gender, region, in some cases education, if we have good statistics on these variables. In face-to-face poll, in probability samples, it's usually not a big coefficient. We do not need to correct the sample too much. Wherever in telephone interviews, we usually need to weight quite seriously, and especially by age, level of education, and occupation, because discrepancies are higher. And in telephone polls, we tend to see in our region in Central and Eastern Europe, that more refusals we are getting from older people, rural people, and lower education. And in this case, we have much higher share of well-educated people in the telephone polls, which changes really the results and overestimates education. So here we need to wait. But this is the Hamlet question, really, to wait or not to wait. The main problem with waiting is how reliable statistic do we have? Is it latest census? Do we have really understanding of emigration? Do we really know what are the composition of the residents of country we are doing the poll? And in our region, in former Soviet countries, the big issue, of course, is emigration, both internal and external, and the freshness of statistics. We have a very recent example in one of Central Asian countries where the emigration rate is really high. And for many years, for the polling, the data were not weighted by age, because census show much higher proportion of young and middle-aged people among the citizens of that country who are really working abroad, and this percentage is really high. They are not present in the country. And then after 3 or 4 years not using weight, 2 years ago, it was decided to apply the weight and to make the structure of the sample closer to the structure of census. That led to the very big changes in the results, especially talking about such variables like media consumption, internet users. And then the question remains unanswered. Where is the truth? because if we take the statistic of the census, where people participated in census not necessarily being present in the country, then we assume that they are here, but they are really not here. Therefore, for more than several years, they are somewhere working abroad. And if we speak about elections, voters' surveys, we need to really to measure more accurately preferences and issues which are relevant for these people who will be voting, not for these who emigrated like few years ago and are not going to vote, even being abroad. So that question remains still open, and the main bias, the main problem is reliability of statistics. But if we have quite recent statistics, let's say taken from the voters register, not from the older census, weighting is useful because then it's more accurate, more closer to the composition of the population of the country than the sample where these differences are present. Here is an example of real face-to-face poll. It's conducted by personal interviews in one country recently, and we can compare what the composition of real raw sample, like when weighted data was, then comparing it with statistical data with the census data, and how we apply the coefficients, and we got the weighted data, which are closer to the real statistical data. We see in the first column on weighted data, the discrepancies were really very, very small. They were not very, very high. We had some disproportion on age group, like we had a little bit more younger people than we should have if we use statistical data about composition of the sample, slightly less older people, and slightly more people with university education than it is in the population. So we applied the weights, and we really had our weighted sample much closer, exactly matching the composition using statistical data. That's an example. So to weight or not to weight is the question for pollsters, but you as the users, you should look, when you get the results, you should ask about this passport of the poll, and should ask about the composition of people who were interviewed, and take also statistics and compare these two things. Because I saw some polls in Georgia as well, in Armenia as well, when, okay, it's reported like the totals, the numbers, such percentage of people think that way, such percentage that way. But then when we look at the composition of who was interviewed, we see that it's sometimes too high proportion of urban dwellers, sometimes it's too high proportion of young people, which means it's not representative, and it was not weighted. So this question you should ask the pollster, and you should compare the composition of the sample, weighted or unweighted, with the real statistics on the population's composition. Then you can be sure that you are getting really representative data. Another important issue, as colleagues spoke about, interpretation of various polls, including elections polls, and especially in closely divided electorates. And interpretation is done usually by journalists, by political scientists, by users, politicians themselves. What we should know and where we should be careful. First of all, talking about elections polls, pre-election or even exit poll, the very important issue is margin of error. What does it mean? The margin of error, it's a statistical concept which says about the probability, usually it's 95% probability, that if we do census, if we interview everybody in the country, the results will fall within some interval of our poll results. So usually it's, let's say we are interviewing 1,000 people or 1,500 people in Georgia. And then we can ask, what is the probability that if we interview everybody, 95% probability that we interview everybody, what would be difference? This depends very much on the size of the sample, how many people we interviewed. This is example in the table, margin of error table. What it shows, let's see, sample size is 500 people. It's used in the polling, sometimes 500 respondents are answering. And we ask the question with the answers yes and no. And let's see, 50% of people said yes, I'm voting for that party, 50% said no. In this case, margin of error is plus minus 4.3%, which means that if we interview everybody in, let's say, the city we did the poll, 95% probability that the answers will be between 46% and 54%. And so on. If the difference is bigger in the answers, 25% of people said yes, 75% said no, then margin of error is smaller, 3.8%. When answers is 10% say yes, 90% said no, margin of error is 2.6%, and so on. And as we see in the table, the margin of error is getting smaller with a higher number of interviewed people, but it's very rare that we can do 10,000 or 15,000 interviews. During the exit poll, yes, and therefore an exit poll, the margin of error is about 0.6%. But in usual poll, when we have, let's say, 1,500 respondents and we're getting answers 50 to 50 or 40 to 60, yes and no, the margin of error is 2.5%. But imagine we got an answer like 49% of people said yes, 51% said no. Here we come to the problem of interpretation. Is 51 more than 49 or not? In statistics and in the pollster's language, when the difference is lower than the margin of error, the answer is no. We cannot say that 49 is less than 51 because margin of error is 2.5%. And this was one of the reasons which sometimes is difficult to explain, but the very good example was American president elections, let's say in 2016. After that, in media, among even scientists, it was saying that pollsters were wrong. They did not predict Trump winning in some states or in general. I was in the States during this time observing elections and being with my colleagues, pollsters and consultants. And where was the main problem? The problem was in interpretation. Let's see, I will show you. You see the graph? Yeah. So let's see, we have Michigan. Here we have real results, but
we don't see. I'm sorry, if there is a graph. No, there is.
You can't see it, yeah?
Yeah, no.
Okay, then I'll just give an example. Let's say in Michigan, poll showed that Trump is getting 48, let's say not Michigan, but let's take one state, which the pre-election poll showed that one of the candidates is getting 48.5%, another one 47.9%. And the pollsters were invited to TV. Journalists were asking and saying, so who is winning? Again, in our countries, it's probably not so important, but in the States, if the candidate is winning at least by one vote, he or she is getting all votes from that country, electoral college. So that's very important. The pollster was very honest and said, look, when we get 47.5 and 48.3, we can't say who is winning because margin of error is 2.5%, and it means its result is equal and it can go anyway. And journalists, in many cases, are not taking this answer as an answer. They still need to make the conclusion and to report their viewers, their listeners, that somebody is leading. Again, many of them do not have mathematicians or statistical education, and they cannot understand that 48 is not more than 47 in this case. It's even. So pollsters were honest. They say, we can't tell who is winning. Commentator, interpreter were saying, anyway, 48 is more than 47. So the candidate with 48% is winning. And they made an assumption that this candidate is getting so much electoral votes, he or she is winning this state. And many of these assumptions then were summarized, and conclusion was made that, let's see, in that case, that Clinton is winning, because she was assigned in these very closely divided states, like 0.5% more of votes than her opponent, which was not true. Conclusion should be that we can't say. And if this difference is lower than margin of error, the answer is no, we don't know who is leading. And that's very important for politicians to understand, because you can make sometimes wrong conclusions and wrong predictions when data, hard data, are not supporting this conclusion. I had an example from our country when we were working with one politician whose background was physics, and it's precise, really science. So their party got support of 1.5% of voters in one of pre-election polls, and the margin of error was like 2%. So he made the conclusion that they are getting, in this case, 4%, because it can't be minus 0.5 in his understanding, because we say margin of error is plus minus 2.5%, which is not right. Another important thing when we are interpreting election polls is the question of allocation of undecided voters. Again, in our region, we see quite often this allocation is done automatically. What do I mean? I will show you Georgian example and why it is wrong. Let's see, these are real results, old results from August. So because you are party's members, please do not start criticize the numbers or complain, but this is the illustration. We have two questions. If elections are held this coming Sunday, which party, if any, you would vote? And then we have the question about the second choice. So if this party for some reason is not available or something changes, which would be your second preference? And we have people's choice. But here, what I want to show, the important part is on the bottom. Like 16% of people said don't know, 9% of people didn't answer, and 6% said none. So these people didn't name any party. For the second choice, it's even higher. Okay, so here we have the data from all voters. Then we can divide them into likely voters. So this, we ask people also, if there are elections, are you going to participate? Are you going to vote? And then we are taking not all voters, but these who said they're definitely and probably are going to vote. So it's smaller numbers. But still among them, we have 3% who said none, 15% who said don't know, and 8% who said no answer. So in general, we have 26% of people who didn't name any party. And we need to look who they are. Are they different from people who select some of the parties? The composition, their age, where they live, their education, or their profile looks the same as for some parties. So it might be that due to ideology, due to their values, they would choose some party with higher probability than another. But it's rarely done. And in many cases, then the pollsters or politicians themselves, they just cut these people from calculation. And what happens? I did it to show how it changes. If we just cut these people, 3% of none, 15 of don't know, and 8 no answer, we just take them out of equation. So we proportionally add percentages to every party. But the higher percentage the party initially has, like here we have Georgian Dream, let's say a national movement, the higher proportion we allocate to that party. So our assumption is that these people who didn't decide which party to vote, they would prefer the same parties which others who already made the decision prefer. This is wrong assumption, because if they already prefer leading parties, they would say so. Why they should jump and support leading parties out of nowhere? Usually they don't know because they don't like leading parties, or they don't like any parties, and they just think about whom to vote. And these are these who are going to vote. So automatic allocation really improves standing of leading parties, but its assumption is wrong. Assumption is that they are the same as the rest. If we want to recalculate and we want to decide which parties these people can support, we need one more variable, like negative ratings. We ask people which party you would not vote under any circumstances. Again, we have the same parties here among most often mentioned as we have in the previous slide. So it means these are most popular, but also these are attracting most negative emotions. And it can be assumption that these people who didn't decide which party to vote, they more usually mention these leading parties. So they will select really from smaller parties. So modeling and special calculations should be done to assign these undecided people to some parties, but not to do it automatically as it in many cases is done. And then we compare really uncomparable things. We compare answers of all voters or likely voters with answers which some companies do with this automatic allocation. And I saw this in Georgia in many cases. So just for politicians, be careful when you compare such things. Another thing which is important, just maybe as Friday evening and also this was long week for everybody, just to look at some not so often examined and commented things like social psychology, because again, in the polls, it's usually is dealt with like demographic description, like variables age, gender, education, occupation, location of people. But we know, as I said yesterday, that for the decision making, three really factors are very important. It's rationale or awareness, information about the things we are talking. Let's see, in this case, about elections or parties. Then there are emotions. Do we like or dislike somebody? And then there is behavior. Are we going to act in accordance to our emotions and rationality, or we are going just to complain in Facebook and not to go to vote? So social psychology is very important because lifestyle, people choices, the media they use influence their decision. And again, Georgia is a very good example about really very multicultural and multi-psychological country. Not every country is the same. There are some very homogeneous countries where really lifestyle or psychology of people do not differ so much regardless where they live, on the seaside, in the mountains, or let's say in the rural area or in the big town. And in such countries like we have Armenia, like this example, we have Lithuania, we have Belarus, where it's bigger differences between really cohorts, age groups, young people and older people, than among people who live in different parts of the country. Georgia is a very good example of different segmentation, and in every region, in every part of Georgia, there are some differences, which really you know better than me, but I know this from our numbers. So I want you to show some example on how different people are in their psychological really features in various parts of Georgia. Here we have psychographic map, we call, and the axes are optimism and pessimism. Here we have share of optimists from 0 to 100%. And here on the bottom, we have share of activism, like these are passive people from 0 to active people on the right from here, on that side, 100%. It's measured by statements, by some attitudes and values, and we can see that optimists are looking to the future and see some hope there. Pessimists are looking at the current day and future and do not believe in some positive changes. And activists are going to solve their problems themselves, while pessimists, while non-active people, passive people are waiting for somebody else to do something for that. Here we have a picture how it looks in various parts of Georgia. Country average show that people are slightly over the medium in optimism and slightly over the medium on the activism scale. We can see they are moderately optimists and moderately active. They're not more than half are not waiting for, let's say, politicians or somebody else to solve their problem, but they are going to solve them. But this is country average. In this case, country average is like average temperature in the hospital, because we see very different picture in different regions. And outstanding is in Nhs, where people are less active and much less optimists than people in some other regions. And we have Guria here, where people are much more optimistic and slightly in the medium of activism. Tbilisi, as any capital, is usually more active, even if not more optimism. Samegrelo is also more active here. It's like an example. Why it's important for the elections, let's see, and this is data from several years ago, it's not most recent. There are some changes. Why it's important for politicians. You organize your campaign in any region of Georgia, and you need to talk with your electorate. So here you have optimists and activists. Can show another graph, which is the same really picture as before, but with deeper segmentations. We have active optimists. So these people who believe that if there are any obstacles, they can be overcome, they can be changed, and they are ready to take actions to do this. Passive optimists are these who believe that solutions are possible, but they are not taking action. They wait for somebody really to take actions for them. Passive pessimists, they do not believe that it's possible to improve things, but they are not doing anything. And active pessimists, these who also do not believe that something will be done and will be better, but they are also complaining, they can be protesting, so they are activists, but on pessimist side. In general, in the country, we have the highest share are active optimists, this country average 49%, then we have passive optimists, 17%, passive pessimist 12, and active pessimist 12. But we see in different regions, the picture is very different. And the most active optimists live in Tbilisi, Samegrelo, and Guria. But when we look at Samska Javageti, Shida Kartli, or especially Mtshetam Tianeti, the share of active optimists, you see, it's 3 times lower than in Tbilisi, Samegrelo, or Guria. And we have much higher share of pessimists. So it's one segmentation. Then we have another scales, extroverts, introverts, and traditionalist innovators. Extroverts are open people, these who like to communicate, who are openly expressing their values and their views in public with their friends, and they are really, for them, it's, let's say, COVID was much more difficult than for introverts who better read the book, better be alone or not very actively expressing their preferences. And innovation and tradition, again, these people who are traditionalists, they are afraid of changes and they prefer to stick to the known things, while innovative are looking for some change and something new, even if they don't know that well. In general, country is conservative, and it's similar, in that sense, it's similar to my own country, to Lithuania. People are much more traditionalist than innovation oriented. And also there is almost almost in the middle of extroverts, introverts. A little bit more extrovert than introverts, but not so much. So this is the country average. Again, if we look at the different regions, we see Schetam-Tianeti much more traditional than other regions, together with Shida-Kartli, and also near the medium of introversion and extroversion. In Kakheti, we see people are more closed, more introverts, as well as in Kartli, while again in Samegrelo or in Samska-Jevageti, they are more open, and less traditional than other regions. But in general, everybody is more or less traditional. And if we look at this picture, we see the share of strong extroverts. The highest is again in Guria, and the lowest in Kakheti in this sense. And the share of introverts is highest in Adjara and in Kakheti, and the lowest in Guria. Why these social psychological profiles are important? They are important in interpreting the polls. Let's say that if we see that people in Schetam-Tianeti or let's say in Kakheti are more close, more introverts and traditionalists, it's probably that they will be inclined to vote for the new parties, or they will be more reluctant to answer our questions. And really for politicians, interactions with them, campaign in this region is different than in Guria or let's say in Shida-Kartli, where people have collective different psychology and different way of behaving. So I wanted to show these examples, like showing that not only social demographic is important in interpreting the poll, but also social psychology, values, and the way people prefer to live. So lifestyle and their psychological portrait for understanding and interpretation is very important. And the last thing, which is also discussed quite often, more in media, but sometimes with politicians as well, question, does publication of poll results influence voter decisions? Sometimes politicians and media people complain that by publishing ratings, you inform public that some parties are leading and some are getting less support, and that means that then small parties are suffering. This is like egg and chicken dilemma, really. If the influence would be really significant, that would mean that these undecided people or these people who are choosing in the poll smaller parties would change their mind, and majority of them would stick for the leading party, which not happens. Smaller parties are still getting their voters, and these voters can be angry that their parties are not so popular as the bigger parties or leading parties, but they are not losing because of publication of results. They are not losing their supporters. They usually in highly contested polls, even it can really stimulate their voters not to stay at home, but go and vote to support their party. So that would be my main conclusions. And if you have some questions, yes.
Sure, please. I have a couple of questions, and also I see the raised hand from Teona. Let me switch to Georgian. Rasa, thanks for this interesting presentation. Thank you very much. It was really something. I was a bit intuitive about my country, who is more optimist or pessimist or something like that, but to see it on figures and graphs, and it's more helpful. Thanks for that. So the first question starts from Vano Kechakmadze, and I will ask in Georgian. უარების განაწილების შემთხვევაში იყენებთ თუ არა ალოკაციას, რომელიც ცვლადებით. მეორე შეკითხვა. შეწონვისას გარდა დემოგრაფიული პარამეტრებისა იყენებთ თუ არა სხვა ცვლადებს და მესამე შეკითხვა რამდენად აისახება ფსიქოლოგიური განწყობები არჩევნებზე, რომელზედაც თქვენ ეხლა ისაუბრეთ. მე მგონი თეონასაც აქვს აწეული ხედი და თეონას შეკითხვაც შევაგროვოთ და შემდეგ უკვე შეგვიძლია ქალბატონ რასას რომ მივცეთ რომ გვიპასუხოს. გთხოვთ თეონა, წარმოადგინეთ თქვენი თავი.
გამარჯობა, მე ვარ თეონა ჭალიძე, პარტია სტრატეგია აღმაშენებლის პოლიტსაბჭოს წევრი და სოციალური მიმართულების ხელმძღვანელი. პირველ რიგში მადლობა ორგანიზატორებს ამ ორდღიანი ღონისძიებისთვის და მომხსენებლებს განსაკუთრებული მადლობა. მე შეკითხვა მექნება და სასიამოვნო იქნება ჩემთვის თუ რასას გარდა მაიკი და პიტერიც მოისმეს ჩემს შეკითხვას და თუ ჩათვლიან საჭიროდ და რაიმე მოსაზრება იქნებათ ამაზე მიპასუხებენ. მე ჩვენს ქვეყანაში განსაკუთრებით და ძალიან მაწუხებს და მაინტერესებს კვლევებში რომ ნაკლებად არის ასახული შემდეგი ასე ვთქვათ ასპექტი. კერძოდ ჩვენ ვართ ჩვენი მოსახლეობა არის სულ 3,700,000 საიდანაც 1,000,000-ზე მეტი ადამიანი არის სოციალურად დაუცველი სტატუსის მქონე და მათი დიდი ნაწილი არის პირდაპირ დამოკიდებული სახელმწიფოს სოციალურ დახმარებაზე, ანუ მათი არსებობა ყოველდღიური საკვები პროდუქტის შესაძენი თანხა, ასე ვთქვათ, ხო არის დამოკიდებული ან სხვა სოციალური დახმარებები უშუალოდ სახელმწიფოზე. ანუ ეს ადამიანები არიან გარკვეულწილად მოწყვლადი ჯგუფი და შეიძლება ითქვას, რომ ასე არის გამეფებული ჩვენთან სტერეოტიპი, რომ სწორედ სოციალურად დაუცველი სტატუსის მქონე ადამიანების დიდი ნაწილი არის სახელმწიფო ზეგავლენის ქვეშ და მათ აძლევს მხარს, მათ უჭერს მხარს. თუ რატომ ეს გასაგები არის, ვფიქრობ. და აი ამ კვლევებში ხოლმე არ არის ყოველ შემთხვევაში ჩემთვის არასაკმარისი არის ის, რომ არ არის დაკონკრეტებული სწორედ აი ამ ჯგუფის მიერ გაცემული პასუხები და თქვენი აზრით უნდა იყოს თუ არა ეს ერთ-ერთი მნიშვნელოვანი ცვლადი და როგორ ფიქრობთ შეიძლება თუ არა რომ ამ ცვლადის უგულებელყოფამ გარკვეულწილად საბოლოო შედეგებზე და გაზომვა როგორც ხდება აი ამაზე გარკვეული ცდომილება და ზეგავლენა მოახდინოს თუ არ იქნება ეს სათანადოდ გათვალისწინებული. მადლობა.
თეონა შეკითხვისთვის. Rasa, Peter, Michael, I think this Teona's question from the party of strategy builder was a few, so. Please, Rasa. We can't hear you, Rasa. I think you should unmute.
If you can also repeat in English because I didn't hear in English. So.
Okay, so let's repeat Teona's question. Or okay, Teona asked you. There is a situation in Georgia like this that people, I mean, the voters are socially insecure people, unprotected, and there is a huge number of this because of our economic conditions, because we're a developing country, and we have unfortunately such amount of the population, and generally during the elections these people vote in favor of government because they receive some funds from the government and they are dependent on them, and this variable and this factor seems to play a role in kind of skewing the support of these people socially insecure and like vulnerable people towards the government. And Teona is wondering whether this factor is addressed while drafting the questions or producing the polls, how this sample of population or the part of the population are included and surveyed during the pre-election poll. So this question is towards you and towards Mike and as well as towards Peter.
Okay, if I can answer about Georgia, that what we talked yesterday, that the sample should be representative, first of all. So it means that every subgroup of people, or regardless the most rich oligarchs or the most poor people, is represented in the poll, in the sample by proportion of their proportion in the society. The question is that yes, there are some small fraction of populations which are not reachable during the poll, let's say homeless, people who have no address and are not in homes, people who are in care houses and hospital, and some part of people who live in their castles in very, very rich surroundings where you just cannot get in. Yes, because they are guarded and you cannot really send interviewer to interview. But this proportion is estimated to be not more than 2% of difficult to reach and not reachable people. So in the poll, all parts of demographic groups, of socially unprotected, as you say, or other peoples are included. The sample is representative. Then the question is that sometimes politicians look at ratings and horse race only. They're interested what percentage of people are supporting my party, and they don't look at the context, because any poll measures political sympathies, voters' intentions by batteries of questions. We are addressing issues which are important for voters, for these people. We are addressing their worry, their optimism, pessimism, their intentions to emigrate, their estimation of economy and everything. So that's more important for the politicians to understand than the picture of today's or yesterday's support for the parties, because it changes. And also we know that, yes, it can be two factors. These poor people and less well off, they can tend to vote for people who are in power at the moment because they believe that these people can change the situation. At least they can promise them to increase the pension, social benefits or something. But also there is some barrier after which they are voting in protest. And we had the same in Georgia. We had in one elections when the ruling really parties lost by protest votes. So if this assumption would be true, so we still would have United National Movement in government because people would not vote against them if this your assumption is right. So that's not really the factor always. It depends also on the party's campaigns, and there is some tendency that sometimes when parties do not achieve really what they wanted to achieve, they start to blame voters, that voters are sometimes stupid or do not understand realities, and they are voting for bribery or for some small sums of money. But voters voting for their interests, and if their interest, which is clear from the big poll, from examining issues, if it's clear that their interests are better served by some party or some forces, they are tending to vote for them for various reasons. But they are included in the samples, and yes, they are represented.
Peter, Michael, if you have any additions, and then we have some three questions in row. Rasa, I will repeat the other question put by Ivanovic. Please, Peter, Michael.
So if I understood the question from Tiona, this is a relatively large segment of the population. 1 in 7 is about 14 or 15%, but they might not be well represented in the typical sample for a variety of reasons. First of all, that have to do with access. And ensuring representation in a sample typically would involve extra cost to make contact and to complete an interview. So the sponsor and the pollster would have to make a decision about the importance of this group in principle, and then whether or not they would bear the expense of making contact. Now, there's two different issues, I think, in the content of the poll. If it's a pre-election poll, which I understood was the basis for your question, then there should be a consideration of the differential turnout rate of this group compared to others in the population. And therefore, how important is it to get adequate representation in the likely electorate? But there's a different circumstance in which, for example, the government might be interested in whether or not its service provision is adequate. And there we might be interested in whether individuals in the vulnerable population know about available services, are receiving available services, think there should be other services available. Then we might be interested in a polling circumstance in which we want to oversample this group in order to collect this information to guide legislation or regulation or policy. And again, that would involve potentially additional costs in order to secure interviews from people who are ordinarily underrepresented or might be more disinclined to participate in a poll. So there are technical ways to deal with this issue of representation, either in pre-election polls or in, policy-related polls. But I don't think it's possible to deny that extra costs would be involved, and it should be taken into account when budgeting for this kind of data collection.
Thanks, Mike. Peter?
Well, I'm not clear on the voting implications of the representation of vulnerable people in the samples. So one would like to know, what is the likely turnout for vulnerable people versus non-vulnerable people? And the answer to that question would determine the extent to which I would like to invest more in the measurement of the vulnerable folks, trying to find them and so forth. But if it was determined that vulnerability is highly correlated with party support, then it would be important to measure vulnerability through questions in the poll and to analyze the data that you obtain by cross-tabulating vulnerability and non-vulnerability against voting intention. And it would be important, if there was a correlation, to make certain that we have some way of ascertaining whether we have achieved an adequate sample of vulnerable people. I assume there are proxy variables in the national statistics that could be used for the purpose of ascertaining the quality of the sample and then doing weighting, as Rasa has explained, to correct the sample if the percentage of vulnerable people was not adequate in the achieved sample that has been drawn. But as Rasa explained very well, the national statistics, the quality, the nature of the sampling frame is extremely important for our judgment as to whether the sample has good quality. And so the frame that is used for telephone surveys, for example, may only include telephone numbers, which are linked to aggregate measures of demographic characteristics for the regions in which those phone numbers are being sampled. And so the correction that can be made to a telephone sample may not be especially good as compared with a face-to-face sample. But I want to raise one more question, one more issue that goes to this question of the adequacy of samples. Rasa presented some data that showed the distribution of cases in the sample across different demographic characteristics, and showed how weighting can bring the demographic characteristics of the sample in line with the national statistics. an important thing to understand is how much of a relationship is there between the demographic characteristics that are measurable in the national statistics. How much of a relationship is there between those demographic characteristics and the variables that are of interest to us in the poll? So in some cases, the relationship is quite clear, that rural voters may vote differently than urban voters and so forth. In other instances, the relationship may not be so clear. And those psychographic measures that Rasa presented may have a stronger relationship to voting tendencies in some cases than do the demographic characteristics, or some combination of psychographics and demographics may be a better way of estimating the quality of the sample. But there are no psychographic national statistics. They need to be created before one can start to adjust any given sample against them. But they could be very important. So in the United States, we had instance where in 2016, the samples that were drawn to measure the horse race, Clinton versus Trump, oftentimes were said to have not corrected for an education bias. Now, education may or may not be a prominent variable in the statistics from which a sample is drawn from the frame. They may not be included in the frame. Education is measured differently across states. And so correcting for the fact that Trump voters seem to be of lower education may be more difficult than correcting for other demographic characteristics. Whereas education is more of a psychological individual characteristic than is urban or rural residence, or gender, and so forth. So I guess my point is that we can correct a sample to match the national statistics which are available to us. But we cannot correct for things for which we do not have a measure in the frame. And those things may turn out to be useful or predictive of voting behavior. We would like to know whether the sample is a good sample of voters, of prospective voters. And what we often have is a sample which is a good sample of the national population, not necessarily of voters, because we don't have a way to wait for them in the frame. So anyway, just a caveat, if you will, about correcting the sample for different types of non-response issues.
Thanks, Peter. Michael at Rasa. I will repeat the question that was asked, and I guess it was translated, but let me translate it myself as well directly to Rasa. In case of non-response rate distribution, do you use allocation method, and what variables are included there? And during the weighting, besides the demographic parameters, do you use any other variables or factors? And the third question was about to what extent this psychological sets and moods that you presented have effect on electoral results, or just in on the elections generally. These are the three questions for Rasa that Vano Pechahmadze asked, and then we have one more question which I ask later.
Okay, I'll try to be short in this.
Sure.
Well, it depends on the reporting and polling. If there are like regular social social, political, economic polls, and or let's say party support is just one of the questions, one of the measures. We usually present results from all voters, as I showed, and from likely voters if it's closer to elections. We usually do not do likely voters estimation if it's 2 years before the elections, because it's too far away, and the intentions can be very, very draft. But if it's closer to the elections, we ask whether you are going to vote or not. And then we take these likely voters and we compare results from all voters with these. And in this reporting, we do not allocate these who refuse to see or these who are undecided. We show their percentage and we see that this is not prediction of the outcome of election. This is sympathies, intentions of the electorate at this moment. And these undecided can go anyway. This is for politicians to work with these undecided to really try to attract them to their side. This is not predictions. If I work as a consultant for some party or politician, yes, then we do modeling, but this is usually not publicly reported, or this is like the tool for political party to make their decisions how to attract polls. So these are different, let's say, pollings, and this we do more like in Lithuania and other countries. In Georgia, because we work with the National Republican Institute, we do not allocate, we use this general polling. It's possible to do using not only demographic, but some consumption, media usage variables, so it's much more difficult modeling for allocation. So this first and second question, the same. And the third question about psychographic, yes, it's not only interesting to look at the psychology of your own fellow people, but also it has really very good empirical and practical implications, both for marketing, let's say, and for policies, because depending on the psychology, on people's openness, closeness, activity, preparedness to act, you should use different strategies to reach them and to sell them either product or to sell them ideology or party program, which is the same selling process. And yes, differences in these psychological profiles have direct impact on voting behavior, how they respond to the campaign, how they respond to the messages. In some cases, like a very broad example, you can organize pre-election concert in Guria, and it will be much more attractive for voter there in open space, if it's not COVID situation, but if it's allowed big meetings, and it will have effect. If you do this in set up Tianeti, they will think you crazy, and it will not work. Some younger people may come, but the older people will sit in their houses with closed curtains and look suspicious at you. But if you go with a bottle of chacha to the eldest guy in Tianeti village and talk with him one-to-one and persuade that your policies are right, he will take all his family to vote for you. It's just very simplified example, but these psychological profiles really are working because we act on the basis of our emotions, on our values and beliefs in any situation. And Georgia is a very good country for such segmentation because it really works here.
Thanks for your exhaustive answers, Rata. Thank you. I have one more question from Nina Chochia, who works for the Human Rights Committee of the Parliament of Georgia. Let me translate this. There is some very topical issues, which are very important to during some periods of time. Sometimes this kind of topicality fades over time. Like, let's say hydroelectric dams that we are building now, when people are against these constructions, and we have the demonstrations, but this demonstration might kind of weaken or fade up. So when is the right time to conduct polls? When there is a high political or social temperature, or when this is calm situation and people are not so kind of against and in the street? So which is the right time to do the polls?
Well, let me comment on this without, I hope, you understand overly emphasizing the importance of cost considerations. From an understanding perspective, the best circumstance is to have regular polling. It doesn't have to be frequent, but systematic data collection, so that you have a baseline and a benchmark set of measures. And then under difficult circumstances, for example, like demonstrations in the street, you can take another measurement and you'll be able to assess the difference, whether there's a difference in attitudes. Obviously, there's a change of behavior, whether there's a different level of attitudes or preferences based upon the current circumstances in relation to what you ordinarily observe. So there is no best time really to identify a point of data collection, a field period for data collection. But again, context is important. And the question that you want to ask is, are attitudes different than they ordinarily were? Is feeling more intense than it ordinarily is? And you can only do that by comparison with prior data.
Thanks, Mike. Peter, Rasa, would you like to comment on something or just makes final remarks? As I see, we are on time exactly, and I guess I don't see any raised hands and any questions, so possibly we make some final remarks and then conclude, if you would like so to do. No?
I think most everything has been said on this topic. I thought the two presentations were very helpful in laying out a number of the issues that pollsters face and consumers of polls face in attempting to use polls for the various purposes that they would like them for them to be employed. I hope that I'm a little worried that I got a little too carried away with the technicalities of the weighting toward the end, but anyway, I hope it was useful for the folks in who have been attending this seminar.
Thanks. Thank you so much, everyone. Დიდი მადლობა პოლიტიკური პარტიების წარმომადგენლებს, პარლამენტის თანამშრომლებს, ჩვენს სპიკერებს, ჩვენს მხარდამჭერებს და ორგანიზატორებს ამ ღონისძიების. ჩვენ გავაგრძელებთ ამ სერიას. მომდევნო სემინარები არის განკუთვნილი ჟურნალისტებისათვის, ხოლო დასკვნითი სემინარები კი აღმორჩევლებისათვის, კონკრეტულად კი სტუდენტებისათვის. დიდი მადლობა კიდევ ერთხელ და იმედია კვლავ შევხვდებით. დიდი მადლობა აირაი საქართველოს and thank you very much. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.